If you are looking for easy success, fast results, or a life that changes without any real effort, you are in the wrong place. Because nothing in your financial life changes without structure, awareness, and responsibility. And if you are still here, good. Because this is not content for entertainment. This is for people who are ready to understand something most will never see. That your environment is not just where you live, it is what is silently shaping your financial future every single day. Your habits, your decisions, your money behavior, your identity. All of it is being influenced by the system around you. So if you are still here, settle in, pay attention, and watch this until the end. Because once you see this system clearly, you will never be able to ignore it again. Before we begin, like the video, subscribe and stay with me, so I know how many of us are actually serious about change. Now we begin. Most people believe their financial life is determined by effort. Work harder, stay disciplined, find better opportunities, earn more, and eventually things will change. But there is something they completely ignore, something far more powerful than effort: your environment. Not just your physical environment, but everything around you that influences how you think, act, and behave every single day. Because your environment is not passive, it is active. It is constantly shaping your decisions without asking for permission. The people you are around, the content you consume, the conversations you repeat, the lifestyle you observe, the standards you normalize, all of it is programming your behavior. And most people never notice this because it does not feel like control. It feels like normal life. But normal life is exactly where systems operate the most effectively, silently, consistently, without resistance. And this is why financial outcomes are not random. They are not purely based on intelligence or discipline. They are heavily influenced by what surrounds you every day. If your environment rewards consumption, you will consume. If your environment rewards distraction, you will be distracted. If your environment rewards short-term pleasure, you will prioritize it over long-term structure. Not because you are weak, but because you are adapting. Human behavior is not independent. It is responsive. It mirrors the environment it is placed in, which means something uncomfortable is true. You are not fully choosing your financial behavior. A large part of it is being shaped before you even make a decision. And this is where most people misunderstand their own life. They think their financial situation is a result of personal failure, but in reality, it is often a reflection of environmental design. The system around you is silently reinforcing certain behaviors and slowly discouraging others. And over time, this creates a pattern, a predictable financial identity, not because you decided it consciously, but because it was reinforced repeatedly. And anything reinforced long enough becomes automatic. This is why change feels so difficult for most people, because they try to change behavior without changing environment. But behavior inside an unchanged environment will always drift back to default. So the real question is not, how do I become more disciplined? The real question is, what environment is shaping my discipline in the first place? Because until that changes, nothing else will stay changed for long. In the last part, we established something most people never fully accept. Your environment is not passive, it is active. It is shaping your behavior, your decisions, and ultimately, your financial life. But now we need to go deeper, because environment is not just physical space. It is not just your home, your city, or your job. It is also something invisible, something you interact with every single day without even noticing it. Your attention environment, the content you consume, the information you expose your mind to, the conversations you repeat internally and externally, the digital world you live inside. This is where modern financial behavior is actually shaped, not in a single moment of decision, but through repeated exposure. Because what you repeatedly see becomes what you normalize, and what you normalize becomes what you accept as possible. Most people underestimate this completely. They believe they are just watching content or scrolling for a few minutes. But from a system perspective, every piece of content is a behavioral input. It is either reinforcing discipline or reinforcing distraction. It is either strengthening long-term thinking or strengthening short-term impulse behavior. And the problem is not one single video or one single post. The problem is accumulation, because small inputs repeated over time become identity-shaping forces. This is why two people with similar intelligence and similar opportunities can end up in completely different financial realities. Not because one is more capable, but because their attention environments are different. One environment rewards focus, learning, and building. The other environment rewards stimulation, distraction, and consumption. And over time, both individuals start to reflect their environments. This is not theory. This is behavioral conditioning, and it is happening constantly, even when you are not aware of it. Every time you consume content that is centered around entertainment, your brain adapts to expect stimulation. Every time you consume content centered around urgency, drama, or instant reward, your brain adapts to expect speed over patience. And when your brain adapts to speed, slow processes like building wealth, learning skills, or developing systems start to feel uncomfortable, not because they are difficult, but because they are no longer aligned with your attention pattern. This is one of the most dangerous hidden effects of modern environments. They change your perception of time, they change your tolerance for effort, they change your relationship with delayed reward. And without realizing it, they reshape your financial behavior. Because financial success is not just about knowledge, it is about what you can sustain mentally over time. And if your environment constantly resets your attention, you will struggle to maintain long term focus on anything that requires consistency. This is why many people feel like they are always starting over, starting new goals, starting new habits, starting new financial plans, but rarely sustaining them long enough for compounding to begin. Because the environment they return to every day resets the system. It pulls them back into short term cycles, and over time, this creates a pattern that feels like personal failure. But it is not personal failure, it is environmental dominance, and this is the part most people never question. They try to fix behavior without fixing input. They try to build discipline while staying inside systems that constantly break it down. But discipline cannot survive constant contradiction. If your environment rewards one type of behavior and your goals require another, the environment usually wins, not because it is stronger, but because it is constant. And consistency always shapes identity more than intention. So the real issue is not what you want to do with your life. The real issue is what your environment repeatedly trains you to do instead. And until that conflict is addressed, financial change remains unstable because you are trying to build structure inside a system that is constantly reshaping you in the opposite direction. At this point, something should start to become clear. Your environment is not just influencing you, it is shaping you. But there is a deeper layer most people never question, because the most powerful systems are not the ones that feel extreme. They are the ones that feel normal. And this is where the real trap exists. Your normal life is not neutral. It is designed, not by intention, but by repetition, by habits, by the standards you absorbed over time without questioning them. Most people think financial limitation comes from obvious problems: low income, bad luck, lack of opportunity. But in reality, most financial limitation comes from what feels normal, because normal defines your ceiling. If your normal life includes constant consumption, you will never question spending patterns. If your normal life includes distraction as default, you will never question lack of focus. If your normal life includes immediate gratification, you will struggle to build anything that requires delay, because what is normal does not feel like a decision, it feels like identity. And identity is the strongest system in human behavior. This is why change is so difficult, not because people do not know what to do, but because what they need to do feels unnatural compared to what they are used to. And anything that feels unnatural creates resistance. Not logical resistance, emotional resistance. A subtle discomfort that pushes you back toward what is familiar. This is where most people lose progress, not in dramatic failures, but in small returns to normal behavior. A day of discipline followed by a return to distraction. A week of saving followed by emotional spending. A period of focus followed by mental fatigue and escape. And every time this happens, the system resets. Because consistency is not just about effort, it is about stability of behavior across time. And stability depends on environment more than intention. This is why so many people feel stuck in cycles. They improve for a short period, then return to baseline, then improve again, then return again. Not because they lack capability, but because their baseline environment does not support the new behavior long enough for it to become permanent. And over time, this creates a false narrative: the belief that this is just how I am. But that belief is not reality. It is repetition mistaken for identity. Because if you repeat something long enough, it feels like who you are, even if it is just what you have been exposed to. This is why most financial behavior is not consciously chosen. It is inherited from environment, from what was normalized around you, from what you saw growing up, from what you see every day now, from what your attention is repeatedly exposed to. And once something becomes normal, it stops being questioned. which means the system stops being visible. And what you cannot see, you cannot change. This is the most dangerous part of environmental influence. It does not force you. It shapes you quietly until resistance feels unnatural, until discipline feels uncomfortable, until focus feels difficult, until long term thinking feels foreign. And at that point, you are no longer fighting the environment, you are expressing it. So the real question is not, why can't I stay disciplined? The real question is, what part of my environment makes discipline feel like an exception instead of a default? Because until that is answered, you will always return to what feels normal, even if it is the very thing keeping you stuck. By now, you should start noticing a pattern. Nothing in your financial life is happening randomly. It is being shaped by environment, by repetition, by what feels normal. But there is another layer underneath all of this that most people never question. And it is the reason why even smart, capable, hardworking people stay stuck for years. That layer is comfort. Not comfort in the obvious sense, not luxury, not pleasure, but psychological comfort. The feeling of familiarity, predictability, low uncertainty. Your environment is constantly building a comfort system around you. And that system is extremely powerful because comfort does not feel like a trap. It feels like stability. It feels like safety. It feels like this is just life. But in reality, comfort is often the mechanism that prevents change, because every meaningful financial shift requires discomfort at the beginning. New behavior feels uncertain, new structure feels unnatural, new identity feels unstable. So the brain does what it is designed to do. It pulls you back toward what feels safe, even if what feels safe is also what keeps you stuck. This is where most people misunderstand their own behavior. They assume they are choosing stability, but what they are actually choosing is familiarity. And familiarity is not always aligned with progress. For many people, their current financial environment is not aggressive. It is not chaotic. It is not extreme. It is comfortable enough to prevent urgent change, but not strong enough to create freedom. And this is one of the most dangerous states a person can be in. Because when pain is too low, there is no urgency. And when urgency is absent, change gets postponed indefinitely. So people stay inside systems that are good enough to survive, but not structured enough to grow. They have income, they have routines, they have stability, but they do not have direction, because comfort replaces direction with maintenance. You are no longer building a future, you are maintaining a present, and maintenance feels productive, because you are constantly doing something, working, paying bills, managing life, handling responsibilities. But none of it necessarily creates upward movement. It just preserves the current level, and preservation slowly becomes limitation. This is why many people feel like time is passing, but nothing is changing, because their system is optimized for stability, not expansion. And the longer you stay in that system, the more it becomes invisible. You stop questioning it because it works well enough. But well enough is one of the most expensive traps in financial life. It keeps you functional, but not free, stable, but not progressing, comfortable, but not expanding. And over time, your expectations adjust downward to match the system you are in. You stop expecting growth, you start expecting maintenance. And once expectations change, behavior follows. This is how environment locks people into cycles without force, not by restricting them, but by making the current state feel acceptable, even desirable. Because compared to uncertainty, stability always feels better in the short term. But in the long term, stability without growth becomes stagnation, and stagnation slowly becomes identity. This is where people begin to say things like, "This is just how life is. I'm doing okay. At least things aren't bad." But none of those statements represent growth. They represent adaptation. Adaptation to a system that is no longer pushing forward. So the question becomes deeper now. Not just what environment you are in, but what that environment is training you to accept. Because whatever you repeatedly accept eventually becomes your limit. And most people are not limited by what they cannot do. They are limited by what they have normalized. This is the comfort system. And it is one of the most invisible forces in financial life. Because it does not feel like resistance. It feels like peace. But not all peace leads to progress. Some peace is just pause disguised as stability. And if that pause lasts long enough, it becomes your entire trajectory. In the next part, we go deeper into how this system directly affects money behavior, and why most people unknowingly structure their financial life around comfort instead of accumulation. At this point, you should understand something important. Your environment is not just shaping your mindset, it is shaping your behavior. And behavior is where money actually moves, not in theory, not in intention, but in real time decisions. Every financial outcome in your life is the result of a decision you made in a specific moment to spend, to save, to delay, to invest, to ignore, to justify. And most people believe these decisions are independent, that they are fully conscious choices made in isolation. But that is not how behavior actually works, because most financial decisions are not created in the moment. They are influenced before the moment ever arrives, through environment, through repetition, through exposure. If your environment normalizes spending, spending becomes automatic. If your environment normalizes upgrading lifestyle with income, you will do the same without questioning it. If your environment never discusses saving, investing, or long term structure, those behaviors will feel foreign to you, not because you don't understand them, but because they are not reinforced around you. And human behavior always defaults to what is reinforced, not what is understood. This is one of the most misunderstood parts of financial life. People assume knowledge creates change, but knowledge without environmental support does not survive under pressure. Because the moment emotional pressure appears, behavior reverts to the strongest pattern in your environment, not your strongest intention. This is why so many people know exactly what they should do with money, but still do something completely different. They know they should save more, but they don't. They know they should avoid emotional spending, but they still do it. They know they should build structure, but they never fully implement it. And over time, this creates frustration, because there is a gap between awareness and action. But that gap is not a character flaw, it is a system mismatch. You are trying to operate at one level of behavior while being constantly influenced by another, and the stronger influence always wins. This is why environment is more powerful than discipline, because discipline is internal resistance, but environment is external reinforcement. And external reinforcement repeated over time becomes identity. So when people say, I can't control my spending, what they are really describing is not lack of control, it is environmental programming. Because in the right environment, control becomes easier, not harder. In fact, it becomes natural. You don't need to constantly fight impulses, because impulses are not constantly triggered. But in the wrong environment, every day becomes a negotiation, every decision becomes a struggle, every purchase becomes a justification process, and that drains mental energy, not just financial resources. And over time, exhaustion leads to surrender, not dramatic surrender, but slow behavioral relaxation. You stop resisting, you stop analyzing, you stop questioning, and you begin to operate on autopilot again, which brings you back to the same cycle. This is why financial change is not just about learning better strategies. It is about changing the conditions that shape your decisions. Because if the conditions stay the same, the outcomes will also stay the same, even if your intentions improve, even if your motivation increases, even if your knowledge expands. None of it matters long term without environmental alignment. This is also why many people experience temporary financial improvement, followed by regression. They change behavior for a short time, but their environment remains unchanged. So the system eventually pulls them back, not immediately, but gradually, until old patterns feel normal again, and this creates the illusion that nothing works. But the truth is simpler. You were never changing the system. You were only trying to override it, and no override lasts forever. So the real shift is not, how do I control my money better? The real shift is, what in my environment is constantly shaping the way I handle money without me realizing it? Because once you see that clearly, you stop treating financial behavior as personal failure and start seeing it as system output. And when something becomes system output, it can be redesigned. At this point, something should be becoming very clear. Financial struggle is not just about knowledge, it is not just about effort, and it is not even just about discipline. Because discipline on its own is not a permanent solution, it is a temporary force, a temporary override, a short term resistance against long term influence. And most people misunderstand discipline completely. They think discipline means control, that if you are disciplined enough, you can overcome any situation. But in reality, discipline is not stronger than environment. It is just louder in the beginning. Because discipline requires conscious effort, it requires attention, it requires energy, it requires constant decision making. But environment does something different. Environment does not require effort, it requires exposure, and exposure is constant. This is why discipline always loses over time if the environment does not support it. Not immediately, but gradually, because every disciplined decision requires energy, and every environmental influence is effortless. So over time, the system with no effort always wins against the system that requires effort. This is the hidden reason why people fail to stay consistent financially. They try to use discipline to fight an environment that is designed to produce the opposite behavior. And this creates internal conflict. You try to save money, but your environment normalizes spending. You try to think long term, but your environment rewards short term stimulation. You try to build structure, but your environment constantly pulls you into reaction. And this conflict drains mental energy faster than most people realize, because every moment becomes a choice point, every decision becomes a battle, every impulse becomes something you must resist. And resistance is exhausting, not emotionally at first, but cognitively, because the brain is constantly being asked to override its default programming. And no system can sustain that level of resistance indefinitely. Eventually, something gives, not because you are weak, but because the system is stronger than individual effort. This is why many people experience cycles in their financial behavior, periods where they are disciplined, where they save, where they focus, where they try to build something meaningful. But then slowly, that discipline fades, not in one moment, but through small compromises. A small purchase here, a justification there, a moment of fatigue, a return to comfort, and each small shift feels insignificant in isolation. But collectively, they reverse the entire trajectory until behavior returns to baseline. And baseline is always shaped by environment. This is the part most people refuse to accept because it removes the illusion of full control. It shows that discipline alone is not enough if the surrounding system is constantly working against it. And that realization is uncomfortable because it means effort is not the final answer. But it is also liberating because it shifts the focus away from self blame and towards system awareness. Because if discipline fails in a strong opposing environment, then the solution is not more discipline. It is environmental redesign, not trying harder, but changing the inputs that require constant resistance in the first place. This is why some people seem to achieve financial consistency with less visible effort, not because they are more disciplined, but because their environment supports their discipline. They are not constantly fighting impulses, because impulses are not constantly triggered. Their system is aligned with their goals, so behavior becomes stable, not forced. And when behavior becomes stable, financial outcomes become predictable. And predictability is the foundation of growth, because randomness destroys progress, but stability allows compounding. So the real problem is not discipline itself. The real problem is using discipline as a long term strategy inside a system that is designed to break it down. And once you understand this, you stop asking, how do I become more disciplined? And start asking, what environment is constantly making discipline necessary in the first place? Because a well designed system does not require constant discipline, it produces correct behavior by default. And that is the real difference between struggle and structure. In the next part, we begin to connect everything together. Because once environment, behavior, and discipline are understood, the final layer becomes visible, the system of identity. At this point, the pattern should be impossible to ignore. Your financial life is not random, it is not purely logical, and it is not just the result of discipline or effort. It is the result of a system, an environment shaping behavior, behavior repeated over time, and discipline trying to resist it. But even if you remove distractions, even if you improve your environment, even if you understand your behavior deeply, there is still something underneath everything else that decides whether change actually lasts. And that layer is identity. Because identity is what remains when motivation disappears. It is what remains when discipline weakens. It is what remains when the environment is not actively influencing you. Identity is the internal definition of who you are, and everything in your life tends to align with that definition over time, not immediately, but consistently. Because the brain seeks consistency above all else. It prefers stability of identity more than improvement of outcome. So if there is a conflict between what you do and who you believe you are, identity always wins in the long run. This is why so many people experience temporary financial improvement. They change behavior for a short period. They start saving, they start planning, they start thinking differently. But internally, their identity has not changed. And because identity has not changed, behavior feels temporary, like something they are trying rather than something they are. And anything that feels temporary cannot survive pressure. Because the moment stress returns, the system defaults back to identity. Not intention, not discipline. Identity. This is why people often say things like, I always end up back where I started, or I can change for a while, but then I go back. And they interpret this as failure. But it is not failure, it is identity consistency. Because identity is designed to maintain stability, even if that stability is limiting, even if that stability is uncomfortable, even if that stability is not aligned with long term goals. The brain prefers known patterns over uncertain transformation. So when you attempt to change your financial behavior, there is an internal resistance, not always visible, but always present. A subtle pull back toward what is familiar, because familiar equals identity, and unfamiliar equals threat, even when unfamiliar is better. This is why financial growth often feels uncomfortable in the beginning, not because it is difficult, but because it conflicts with identity. Saving more money can feel unnatural if your identity is built around spending freely. Thinking long term can feel restrictive if your identity is built around living in the moment. Building structure can feel limiting if your identity is built around flexibility and spontaneity. And in each case, the discomfort is not coming from the action itself. It is coming from the mismatch between action and identity. So most people unconsciously resolve this tension in the easiest way possible. They return to identity. They stop the new behavior. They reduce the discipline. They relax the structure. And slowly, everything goes back to normal. Not because they made a conscious decision to fail, but because identity always restores equilibrium. This is the real reason change feels temporary for most people. They try to build financial success without updating the identity that produces financial behavior. And without identity alignment, every system eventually collapses back into default patterns, even strong ones, even well-designed ones, because identity is the operating system underneath everything else. Environment influences it, behavior expresses it, discipline attempts to override it, but identity determines the final direction. So the real question is not, what habits should I build, or even, what system should I follow? The real question is, who am I becoming through the system I am trying to build? Because if identity does not shift, then behavior will always eventually return to its original form, and financial life will remain cyclical, periods of improvement, followed by regression, again and again, until the identity itself is rewritten through repetition. And this is where everything begins to connect, because environment shapes behavior, behavior reinforces identity, and identity determines what environments you tolerate. It is a loop, a closed system. And most people are stuck inside that loop without realizing it, not because they lack knowledge, but because they are trying to change one part of the system without changing the system itself. In the final part, we bring everything together: environment, behavior, discipline, identity, and the structure that determines whether you stay stuck or finally exit the cycle. At this point, everything should be connected, not as separate ideas, but as one system, because nothing in your financial life exists in isolation. Not your income, not your discipline, not your habits, and not even your motivation. Everything is part of a structure, a loop, a system that repeats itself every single day. And the reason most people never escape financial struggle is not because they lack information, but because they keep trying to change individual parts of the system without ever changing the system itself. So let's bring everything together clearly. There are four layers that shape your financial reality: environment, behavior, discipline, identity. And they are not separate, they are connected in a loop. Your environment influences your behavior. Your behavior repeated over time builds identity. Your identity determines what environments you tolerate. And discipline exists only as a temporary force between all of them, trying to override the system, but never replacing it. This is why most financial improvement is temporary, because people try to fix behavior without fixing environment. They try to force discipline without changing identity. They try to improve income without changing structure. And because the system remains the same, the outcome remains the same, even if effort increases. Even if knowledge increases, even if motivation increases, nothing fundamentally changes until the system changes. So the real question is not, how do I make more money? Or even, how do I become more disciplined? The real question is, what system am I currently operating inside that is producing my financial reality right now? Because your current life is not random. It is the output of a system that is already running. Every decision you make, every habit you repeat, every pattern you fall back into, it is all being generated by that system. And systems do not change through awareness alone. They change through redesign. That means changing what influences you daily, changing what behaviors are rewarded, changing what identity you reinforce, and changing how decisions are structured over time. This is where most people misunderstand transformation. They think change is emotional. They wait for motivation. They wait for clarity. They wait for the right moment. But real change is structural. It happens when the system starts producing different outputs automatically, not through effort, but through design. And once the system changes, everything inside it changes with it. Because behavior follows structure, identity follows repetition, and results follow behavior. So financial freedom is not a single breakthrough moment. It is the result of building a system where your environment no longer pulls you into distraction. Your behavior is aligned with long-term direction. Your discipline is no longer constantly required, and your identity supports the life you are trying to build. This is what most people never reach. Not because it is complicated, but because it requires letting go of the idea that effort alone is enough. Effort is part of the system, but it is not the system itself. And if effort is placed inside the wrong structure, it only produces exhaustion, not freedom. So the final truth is simple. You are not stuck because you are incapable. You are stuck because you are operating inside a system that is designed to maintain your current level of life, not to elevate it. And until that system is changed, your financial reality will remain predictable, not because you lack potential, but because you are repeating the same structure that created it. So the exit is not found in motivation, it is not found in discipline, and it is not found in working harder. The exit is found in redesigning the system completely, from environment to behavior to identity to structure. And when that happens, change stops being temporary and becomes inevitable, because a new system will always produce a new result every single time. This is Max Solven, and if you understood this, you are no longer inside the same cycle you started with. Now it is only a question of what you do with it. I'll see you in the next one.